Okay, there we go. I was having a few technical difficulties this morning. I'm actually recording this on Wednesday. Um, so you will get this video later tonight or tomorrow morning. Your response to room 19 is due tonight by midnight. And I just wanted to move forward. So we're talking about Auden, W.H. Auden. And it's so funny because his elegy, as I explained in the assignment, an elegy is a poem that's written about or in honor of a person or a literary figure who has passed on. So your assignment for this reading is to write your own elegy, as I recall, if I look back in my assignments that I created last month. So it's challenging to write your own elegy, but think about somebody you know. It doesn't have to be a literary figure. It doesn't have to be somebody famous. Could be if you want it to be, but somebody maybe that you was close to you that you want to write in verse in response to their passing on. So the Auden poem is in 3 parts. I have it printed out, right? Okay, so you have that online. It's in 3 parts. Often poets will write 3-part poems, 5-part poems. Many poets have written 10-part poems. People like poets like William Wordsworth have written the preludes, it's an extensive, that was a 19th century poet, extensive, almost like a long book of poems. And several poets from the 19th century did that. 20th century poets wrote a little bit shorter. Just to give you a little background information, Auden was writing at a time that was kind of, a couple of decades after Yeats's passing on. W.B. Yeats stands for William Butler Yeats. And he kind of, Yeats was on the verge of, there were the Romantic poets, and then he's considered a modern poet. There are ages of poets, the Romantic age or the Romantic era. So he kind of crossed. He was like a what we would call a cuspy, right? Like with generations, like he was cusped between Romantic and modern, but he is considered a modern poet, or was. And I think that what I'm going to do today is I'm first going to read to you Yeats's most famous poem, and you may be already familiar with this. It's called The Second Coming. And because, the reason why Auden elegized Yeats, because he was such a prominent poet during his time and canonized all over the place. And he was responding, his poems were in response to the British imperialism, which we did talk about a little bit with Orwell. Britain kind of was a major power during the earlier part of the 20th century. And Yeats is actually an Irish poet. Auden was a British poet. So I'm just going to read The Second Coming, and we can talk about it a little bit, or I can. And it's such a shorter poem. It's one of his shorter poems. Okay, so turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of a passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image of spiritus mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. So there is a little bit of religion involved in this. When we talk about the second coming, of course, we talk about Christ, but this poem kind of flips it and suggests that the second coming, when they say, well, what rough beast slouches toward Bethlehem to be born, we're kind of, kind of like immured in this nightmare between a kind of devilish figure rising as opposed to Christ, and the kind of gloom and doom that has what existed back then. It's kind of actually applicable to today, and probably other times in history. Now with the coronavirus and all of the climate change and all of the catastrophes that we supposedly are experiencing right now. Everybody's kind of like, religious people are like, oh, the second coming is happening, the end of the world is happening. Of course, the end of the world has always been happening. Everybody always says the end of the world is coming, age after age after age, even after the book of Revelation was written in biblical times. Since then there have been these like moments in history where people stop and say the end of the world is coming, just because things are so egregious that are happening. So this poem, if you ever study it closely, bears a kind of like you talk about anarchy. Some people would say we're in the midst of anarchy right now. But it's a wonderful poem to read if you get your hands on it. You can look it up online. It's called The Second Coming. Certain things you may not be familiar with, like the Spiritus Mundi, which I always tell my poets, find your Spiritus Mundi, a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi, which is the spirit which moves us, right? So it's the spirit. Some people say, once when I was studying poetry at Colgate University, I had a fellowship, and one of the poets that was in residence there was saying, find your Spiritus Mundi, which means like find the spirit which moves you into writing poetry, which I'm going to give you that advice when you write this elegy. I know it's like hard to say, oh, that's just like so vague, that's kind of a vague direction to give us, just find your Spiritus Mundi. Well, how do I do that? I don't know. But it's kind of like, moving into your quiet space. We need that quiet space to write poetry. We need that silence, that ultimate, kind of like reflective silence. So when you're writing your elegy to whoever it is that has passed on, who is important to you, in my assignment, I kind of structured this so that if you look at the poem by Auden, at first he kind of prefaces the setting of where kind of Yeats was kind of like dwelling, this kind of setting, the setting of where his death was. They say, Auden says the day of his death was a dark, cold day, which gives us the sense that this is a gloomy kind of, get the mood that's kind of gloomy. Auden uses a lot of wonderful verbs in his poem, but back to the way it's structured. So the kind of setting, and then part two kind of describes his personality, or what he did, his actions. It's a shorter part. And then the third part kind of culminates it with the praise to Yeats. So, we wonder, like, why was Yeats so important to Auden? Well, if you look at, if you do more studies, and these are American poets, but poets like Allen Ginsberg wrote an elegy to Walt Whitman. So throughout literary history, there are a lot of poets, who have admired poets from the past, and have elegized them. Maybe they didn't know them personally, but the kind of inspiration that was drawn from the poet that they admire compelled them to write this elegy. So maybe there's somebody like that, passed on in your life, like a teacher, a mentor, a relative, somebody who really inspired you. So when you write your elegy, think about somebody who inspired you and try to look at the structure of Auden's poem, and to try to kind of like ape that a little bit, try to ape it, mimic it, to kind of like model it that way, so it almost serves as like a template for how you're going to write your elegy. But if you look through Auden's poem, I really read it. When you read it for the language, because poetry is very different than prose in some ways. We know that Virginia Woolf was a very imagistic writer in her prose. That's uncommon for the most part. I mean, for most prose writers. So even today, I mean, if you look at 21st century writing, bestsellers, that kind of thing, they're not imagistic really that much at all. They focus mostly on the action, on characterization, but it's not that slow-moving imagistic. But if you look at poetry, and poetry, of course, has changed a lot since the 20th century, but Auden especially was a very imagistic poet, very lyrical, very language-oriented. And when I say language-oriented, I mean that he played with the language. So if I can look through here and find, there's one wonderful, I mean, this stanza here. Far from his illness, the wolves ran on through the evergreen forest. The peasant river was untempted by the fashionable quays. By morning tongues, the death of the poet was kept from his poems. Right? And I'm pretty sure I was like, well, how am I supposed to find the meaning in the poem? Well, yeah, I mean, you can extract the meaning however you want to. But to just read a poem for its beauty and for its language, yeah, you kind of wonder, the death of the poet was kept from his poems. Well, that means what? Well, he's passed on. So now his death did not allow him to experience where his poems went, which is what I always talk about. I'm like, well, we all write poetry. This is my literary circles. We all write poetry, but when we're dead, how are we going to know, even if we're published posthumously, how are we going to know where our poems went, or how illustrious they were, or like, how are we going to know who's remembering us, or who's remembering our poems? Well, we're not here anymore, so how do we know? And that's part of kind of the death of a poet. Now he is scattered among 100 cities and wholly given over unfamiliar affections, to find his happiness in another kind of wood, and to be punished under a foreign code of conscience. The words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. So those last two lines there really speak to, modified obviously means to change, but if the man is dead, if the poet is dead, they change in the guts of the living. Guts is a very, what do I want to say? I don't want to say harsh. It's a very resonant kind of word to use. The guts of the living, the entrails, right? The kind of like the way the living, it's not just in the living. It's in the entrails or the guts of the living, right? That's a pretty intense word to use to describe what Auden is trying to describe. And if you move on, I'm not going to read the whole poem. There's a wonderful... And you'll also notice his rhyme scheme changes throughout the poem. That's a side note. In some parts of the poem, uh, there is some rhyme. Um, in other words, in part three, Earth received an honored guest. William Yeats is laid to rest. Let the Irish vessel lie, emptied of its poetry. But lie and poetry are an off rhyme. Um, if you know anything about poetry, about it, it's like when you sing a song. It's a hymn in church or something. It would be poetry, right? Lie and poetry, but it's poetry. Um, it's that kind of um, what they would call a slant rhyme or an off rhyme. What Yeah. And uh, I think that's I think the last quatrain, the last third part is written in quatrains, which are 4-line stanzas. So the last one is, in the deserts of the heart, let the healing fountain start. So we have another rhyme there. In the prison of his days, teach the free man how to praise. So that suggests um, that we are free, right, from imperialism. How to praise Yeats, in his passing. Um, so you'll notice, I think I just discovered something myself. So it's only the third part that's written in quatrains and is rhymed. So he changes his structure, he changes his form in the third section of the poem, and so you could also ape that and mimic that as well. I'm not suggesting that you have to do this perfectly or you have to do this absolutely, um, in adherence to the template of Auden's poem, but I would use that as inspiration. So I'm just going to leave you with that. If you have questions, please email me. You can write on the discussion board what you think. I can interject where, the discussion board starts today, so, I'll interject where I can. I know there's a lot of work on, like, I think it's Wednesdays and Fridays. There's just a lot. That's what the days of, like, working, or writing for my class. But I know that was a brief lecture. I would love to talk more about it. It's hard to, discuss when I'm not getting feedback from you, but I would, just love to hear on the discussion board what you think about poetry in general, Auden's poem, Yeats, what you know about poetry. And I could give, like a 3-hour lecture on poetry. It's very different than prose. And I teach poetry. I teach creative writing. So if you want to sign up for my creative writing class, I think it's full for the spring. But, it's fun. We learn a lot about poetry. We learn a lot about writing verse. But I'm just going to leave you with that. So just let's chit chat on the discussion board, and I'll interject where I can. And if you're having trouble and you're like, I don't know how to write an elegy, I think I defined it for you, but do your best. I'm not grading. This is very subjective, so I'm not grading you on the artistry or the aesthetics of your poem. I'm really just grading you on whether you did it, as far as in adherence to the assignment, and if you did your best, right? Your response papers are more about content, more about how you responded in a way that is a kind of close reading of the piece. This is not a analytical response or a critical response. This is an aesthetic response. So we'll see how you do with it. I'm going to leave you with that. So have a good one. And I don't think you'll be seeing me again until next week. So let's keep the discussion boards up, hand in your assignments. And this course is just flying by. So enjoy the cold weather wherever you are.